All right, we're going to go ahead and transition a conversation from that into other things. So, yeah, welcome. Glad and honored for those of you who have joined us today, as you are joining us. Yeah, would love to hear or see in the chat where you're coming in from. So, again, we're talking about leadership development. So, I assume there's some church leaders on here, perhaps some folks from higher ed, lay folks, other missions agencies, and that kind of stuff. So that'll help us shape the conversation. And folks will continue to join for a little bit. But yeah, what a day to be talking about leadership. And we scheduled this knowing it would fall on election day, and we're not going to get into that kind of leadership per se today. But it's a day when lots of folks are thinking about leadership on different levels. And also church leaders are being looked at in response to other forms of leadership and other societal things happening. And maybe that's felt a little bit more overtly today than some other times in our history. So if you haven't been with us, this is our second to last fall webinar for Saturate, and we've hosted 5 kind of around the theme of Church of the Future. So we spent a lot of time, all of us have this year, looking at our present reality, looking at history, reevaluating things. But we wanted to take this fall and start to look post-COVID, whatever and whenever post-COVID is. But not just to focus on COVID. For many leaders and researchers and missiologists and everyday followers of Jesus, people across the world have seen COVID as merely shining a light on the trajectory that various cultures and various churches have been on for a long time before COVID, and that's certainly true of North America. And so we're asking the question, what can we do? What must we do? And so today specifically, we're asking a big question. What will it look like to develop leaders in the future? What will it look like for churches and parachurches and church-based institutions and schools and seminaries? What will leadership development look like? And like our other questions this fall, this is not just a specific question to COVID. Some of you have been around in this conversation with the increased accessibility and technology and raising costs of higher education and this kind of stuff. Many schools, Bible schools, seminaries, colleges have been making shifts for years and considering changes. So they were ahead of the curve, if I may, as far as pivoting on what leadership development looks like. And at the same time, a lot of local churches have been considering or perhaps reconsidering their place in church-based theological education and leadership development. So that's what we're asking today. What does leader development look like in the future? And I'm glad to have these 2 guys on the webinar to help answer that question, to help consider these things. Brad Watson is Director of Resources for Saturate. He's an equipper and on staff with Soma Culver City in Los Angeles. And then Winfield Bevins, Dr. Winfield Bevins will officialize you today to make you sound like you have way more than either Brad or I do to offer today. But Winfield was a church planter. He's worked in publishing. He's now Director of Church Planning at Asbury Seminary in Kentucky. Both these guys are authors. Both these guys are great thinkers and developers of leaders. They've been friends and colleagues in various functions over the years of myself, and I'm glad to know both of them. And they both just process lots and process well on this specific topic. So Winfield, Brad, thank you guys for joining us today.
Great to be here with you.
I'm not sure if Brad has the ability to unmute himself, which is going to be unfortunate, but we'll figure that out. So let me pray.
There he is.
There we go. Then I'll give these guys the floor and have a bit of conversation. So as we go throughout, post your questions in the Q&A function. We'll get to them toward the end because we want to involve you in this conversation as well. But let me pray and we'll get started. So Father God, I thank you for the fact that every leader, whether it's in any nation or any organization or your church, thank you that every leader is yours. Thank you that you are the one who guides and directs your people, God. Thank you that you are the one who guides and directs the events of history. Thank you for building your church. Thank you for gifting various women and men with different abilities and gifts and passions for the upbuilding of your body. And thank you that your church is perpetuated by the power of your Spirit more than any specific leadership development process for generation after generation and increasingly across the globe. So God, I thank you that you're the one who develops leaders, and would we have this conversation in that acknowledgement, that it's by your Spirit alone that any of this happens, and would you guide us and lead us and teach us through each other, through your word, and through your Spirit today. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Well, let's start by just kind of tossing it to one of you guys. Brad, you want to go first? And I'd love just to know from both of you for a few minutes, kind of what are you seeing in general on the future of leadership development? We'll start there and then have some conversation around it.
Yeah, that's great. When I think about this question that you asked, I remember this book that I read several years ago. It's called The Campfire to the Holodeck. Great cover. There's my joke. And it's interesting because the writer is a PhD in education, but before that he was a developer of user interfaces with Xerox in the 70s and the 80s. And then he became a research professor at Stanford University. And around 2000, he was asked to do a multi-year research project on how technology and the advancements of technology would change education and how people learn things. And he did an interesting thing where he went back into the future and kind of said, how have humans always learned things? And so what he did is he began to look through multiple cultures, multiple eras in human history, and then kind of boiled down to there's 5 ways that all humans learn things. And all 5 of these things have to be present for people to learn and grow and develop skills, abilities, and even knowledge. And he, just to summarize them, it was the campfire. There's always been a space where people gather as a community and listen to the story that makes sense of the world, listen to stories that even teach how to live. And then there was the watering hole, where the community would always gather to get that sort of refreshing water that was essential. But in that, people would talk to one another and begin to realize, oh yeah, that's how that story's true. This is how you're applying it. This is how you're learning it. And then there was also the cave, where humans have to go into some sort of isolated moment without any noise from anywhere else and decide and to even evaluate and explore what's true apart from any other noise. And then there was also, and I think this one's kind of a throwaway for a PhD at Stanford University, but life, that you just have to live through life and apply those things that you've decided in the cave, that you've heard through community and the watering hole, and that you've heard from that campfire environment. You have to actually apply it and learn from it. And then I like to add, because I think I'm smarter than this guy, another thing, which is a Sherpa, a person who will guide you through life and will help you, accomplish the things that you're called and you're led to accomplish, kind of showing you the way. And maybe that's mentorship. But I think as I look at my own life, that's how I've grown and how I've learned. And I think the critique that this guy offers, and I think many people offer, is that for much of the last 50, 60, 100 years in the United States, most of how we've tried to develop people is just with the campfire or the classroom environment, where someone tells and someone speaks. And he even puts reading books into that environment. Reading a book is listening to someone speak and tell you. He even talked about how the creation of the printing press and mass literacy was a technological advancement that spurred on the campfire into a new era. And so then he began to talk about, this is me summarizing a whole book so you don't have to buy it, how technology in the future, which we're kind of living in the present with Zoom and all of these different abilities to connect, is not so much changing how we learn, but just a different access towards learning. And what we might end up doing is favoring just one way of learning to the other. And in that, and even in my own learning, I think that perhaps the greatest threat to us in developing leaders is to forsake the cave portion, where people are away from messages, away from constant stimulation, and are able to process and reflect and have some of that deep reflection for themselves, not just constantly consuming content from a campfire perspective, or even on social media. I think is the environment of the watering hole, where we're just hearing all of this bombardment of information. And so I think for the church in the future, we're going to have to create and help leaders and future leaders learn how to reflect within the cave environment. And I think that that's probably more challenging than ever. As Eugene Peterson used to say, never before have the richest people in the world also been the smartest people in the world and have billions of dollars at their disposal to get our attention. And so I think that that's a big challenge for us as we develop leaders in the future. So those are my opening comments and statements. And that's my challenge, even the people listening to this, is how will you help people actually do some personal reflection along the way and incorporate all of those other things.
Yeah. And real quick, just to summarize, the 5 are the Sherpa that you added was kind of the guide, the mentor, the cave, personal reflection, the campfire is where we're hearing from others. And what are summarize the other 2 real fast?
Watering hole, and then life. Yeah.
Life experience.
Right?
And watering
like
hole.
life experience. Yeah. And so I think in the church, what we've done mostly is a lot of campfire, a whole bunch of campfire. And that's even professionally what some of us learned to do in seminary, and not a whole lot of teaching people how to reflect, not a whole lot of helping people process together like in a community. And I think we've not seen our vocation as equippers or as elders or pastors or clergy, seen the vocation of being a Sherpa to people, walking them through life. Yeah.
All right. Thanks, Brad. Winfield, you can either, as a seminary professor, rebut Brad, or just kind of share general opening thoughts. What do you see as we look at the development of the future?
No, it's good. I love the Sherpa point in particular that I think is particularly significant, that resonates for me. So again, I kind of come at this as a practitioner, a theologian. So my kind of academic discipline's practical theology, where thinking deeply and richly and reflecting on the practices of ministry wherever we are. And I think for the last several decades, even in the missional movement, I think there's been very little theological reflection on why we're doing what we're doing. And I think this is a moment where God's calling the church to reflect deeply on what we're doing and why we're doing it. And I think one of the kind of scarlet threads, if you will, or themes that you see throughout history, when I look at like leadership development, and kind of what's happening in the culture around us, what's the future of the church going to look like? When I kind of look at, I look back to history to see how has the church responded, how has the church raised up leaders, how did Jesus raise leaders? I think of essential texts for me that were very influential. We had when we first planted, we had the Bible, and we had Robert Coleman's master plan of evangelism, which was essentially pouring into 12 key leaders, is what Jesus did. And I love that idea. I've used that before, Brad, is that leadership development in many ways is we're Sherpas. We're coming alongside. We're helping people learn in context, whether you're a pastor, planter, whether you're a nonprofit leader, whether you're a seminary professor. I think seminaries of the future will have to be much more engaging and much more practical. One of the ironies is about 4-5 years before I came to Asbury, I was asked to write a piece in the Village Green of Christianity Today. And Dan Kimball was one leader, and I forgot the other person. And the question was, what will the future of seminary education be? Or something like that. And I was like, I'd planted a church. I was on an island, and I thought, here's my one shot at the seminaries. I'll never be one of them. So I wrote this little piece on how the future of seminary education needs to look much more like the Celtic missionary models, where you have these mission hubs that helped preserve Christianity through the Dark Ages, where people learned in context. They learned on the outskirts of the city. It was holistic. There was prayer. There was mission. These things were all integrated. And in a profound way, that's some of the things we're doing at Asbury. And I think in many ways, not saying it was a prophetic thing that I wrote, but in many ways, I think the things I was kind of thinking through then are some of the things that are most needed now. We do need theological education. We need pastors and leaders to think deeply and richly. And I think there are, again, we're living through these major cultural shifts. And so I think some of the changes and challenges in a theological education environment, but also for, I would imagine, church planning organizations and leaders is we're going to have to think much more kind of in those personal spaces to where, yeah, we want to give people books. Yes, we want to take them through courses. But in the same way, Jesus, hand-selected 12 key individuals. I see leadership development as very much that. One of my close friends and students who just graduated, he's a key thought leader in England, former head of Alpha for Europe. He does church planning at St. Hild College, did his dissertation with me on the kind of the guild model, kind of recovering kind of the craftsman guild for church planning, like a creative where planters and leaders sit under the leadership of someone else who's kind of experienced, and it's kind of an apprenticeship model, if you will. And I think, in many ways, and a number of people have talked about the cultural moment and we're in has a lot of similarities with the Dark Ages. In some ways, we're almost entering into cultural upheavals that are similar to previous ages. And in those time periods, Christianity has thrived and has been passed on through apprenticeship and through kind of these kind of intimate Sherpa, to use Brad's point, Sherpa type relationships. So I think the future of leadership development is going to have to be much more some of that, if that makes sense. Hopefully that wasn't too rambling. I was shooting off the cuff and trying to build off of what Brad was saying there.
No, that's helpful. And what's interesting is hearing both of you say that. I mean, that's I feel like the same thing that folks talked about 20 years ago, though. And like, rather than kind of content delivery and just building people's heads, we need to come alongside, give them the life experience, get them alone in the cave. Why are we seeing, in you guys' opinions and experience, why are we seeing the same thing of going, what we need now is the exact same thing we said we needed 20 years ago, which is probably the exact same thing that they said they needed 20 years before that. Why are we continuing to have the same conversation and yet consistently defaulting to what you're both saying, more content, more campfire?
Well, I'll just say this. I really think that what we are witnessing, and the funny thing is a lot of us have been saying this, kind of, it's the end of Christendom, we're post-Christendom. This is the end of Christendom. This is a new day. And I think, I think we're living in this providential kind of upheaval where I think the Lord is really doing a work in the West where we've been saying, leadership should be this. I think that is absolutely the future of leadership. And I think those that are able to kind of engage in these new realities are going to create the future of the church. Brad?
How do you follow up? This is the end of Christendom. That's pretty great. It feels like we could also be on TV later, like, this is the end of America.
Oh gosh, yeah.
But I think that's really particular. I guess Christendom as we know it, right? Which I think is what you're saying is where
not the end of Christianity. I
right.
think that's the difference.
Right, totally. Whereas, that idea of Christendom, I completely agree with that. I think that this is a particularly new moment because of all of the things that are confronting us and really have for quite some time. I think that in the 80s and the 90s, you had this sort of explosion, even economically, that allowed, I think, the church to kind of reflect the culture, especially in North America, and to just do more economic growth, kind of modeling and shaping. I was actually in my grandfather's barn last week. He told me I could pick out any of his books. He was a missionary, planted churches all over Mexico, Panama, really wonderful guy in the 80s and 90s was most of his ministry, but he had an old book about how it was basically about like church planting is as homes, and it was from the 70s. So I think you're right. There's been a lot of people saying different things, and there was even a leadership development manual that he had that was talking about how we need to do, life on life, life on mission, that kind of Sherpa gilding kind of development of leaders. And that has been a long time. And I would just say, I think that the reason that that's a recurring conversation is that is how Jesus lived. One of the big insights that I got from even that book about future of education is really Jesus modeled that education the best. I mean, he committed himself to the campfire, to the speaking, to the sharing of stories. He committed himself to asking questions and dialoguing with his disciples. He committed himself to walking through life and having them with him. He committed himself to even modeling personal reflection that his disciples clearly took and continued to grow a lot. I think that, for us particularly, I guess I think through the lens of what should a pastor do, because that's my primary role and calling. So how should a pastor, be developing leaders and stuff? And I do think because of the shift of Christendom, that most of the ways that people interact in the world are living under the completely different story or narrative than the biblical story. I do think that pastors will need to engage and kind of think through how are people experiencing all of that discipleship growth to see leaders born and to see healthy disciples who can be healthy leaders. I often hear people complain, sometimes it's myself complaining, where are all the leaders? I wish I had some leaders. They're over there in that person's church. I wish we could get them here in this church. And then you realize, oh, they're probably in my church. I just have to do the stewardship work of it.
Yeah, I think again, I think that's another thing that unites the three of us is a common passion for the recovery of discipleship. And we see that discipleship has always been small, intimate spaces, all from Jesus forward. For instance, a book I came out with last year that actually had really significant research, but very practitioner level written, was Marks of a Movement, What We Can Learn from the Wesleyan Revival for Today. I'm not a Methodist. I'm not advocating for don't become a Methodist. They're in a mess at the moment. But the Wesleyan Revival was one of the greatest documented movements in the Western world that what would a disciple making movement look like? Theology aside, because, we have different views of, Wesleyan Reformed, all of that. But in terms of the practicalities of discipleship, is one of the greatest disciple making movements. And you had these intimate spaces. He created structures for discipleship, and oftentimes it was in the home. He had small groups, which were the class meetings. Then his favorite leadership dynamic was the band meeting. And it wasn't a rock band. He called them a band meeting because it was a band of brothers. And it was 3 to 5 people. It was gender-based. They came together every week. They confessed their sins. There was no curriculum. There was no Beth Moore Bible studies. It was simply asking, questions that, how is it with your soul? Is there any sin in your life? Anyone can do this anywhere in the world. It's replicable. It's what fueled the movement. And I think those spaces are where leaders are made. If we think of, in terms of our own personal lives, somebody discipled us, someone, nobody becomes a disciple in a vacuum or a void or in a closet somewhere. Somebody poured into you. And I think kind of back to that, I think that's the heart of leadership development. What is the telos? What are we, we're ultimately talking about making disciples, right?
Yeah. And that's an interesting point that you guys are both bringing up, because I feel like the relationship between leadership development and disciple making is one that's probably very differently defined, depending on what church or what leader you're asking. And we're saying is maybe even getting to some of the, like, why are we having the same conversation about leadership development we've had for 20 years? Because I believe most folks would say that yes, like a discipleship relationship is very Sherpa-like, whether it's an older leading a younger, or a group of peers, or that kind of, we're walking in this together. But it feels like somehow both, if I can say this, both theological education and leadership development in some veins, in some churches, in some of our minds, kind of get separated from that, as if there's not a significant relationship between discipleship and leader development. And so I'm curious. I've often thought that leadership development is an aspect of discipleship. There's some that would say leadership development is the only thing that discipleship should prioritize. There are others who say if we just do discipleship, leadership development will naturally flow out of it. So I'm just kind of setting up a tension there. I'm curious to know what you've seen and experienced is kind of the relationship between discipleship in general, spiritual growth, discipleship, that kind of stuff, and leadership development. Are they one and the same? Are they two totally separate things? What do you say?
Well, leadership development, obviously there's a part of the confusion is the influence of secular, leadership theory is a secular phenomenon. And so from a Christian perspective, it's kind of like coaching, for instance, church planners, a lot of us have coaching systems, frameworks. Well, the danger with that is adopting a purely secular model for what we view. And this is what's happened in the West. We've created kind of the CEO model of church leaders that, you've got the guy on top, and then you've got kind of this pyramid, scheme underneath him. And, it's a business model. And I think that's the danger. And so as Christian leaders, wherever you serve, and that's one of the challenges, again, in the US right now, is you have this overly, Christianity has kind of been co-opted and politicized, regardless of, from different angles. There's a left and the right kind of looking at Christianity. And so I think we need to recover as Christians that leadership is always, I believe, convictionally about making disciples, raising them up, releasing them, so that they can go replicate and do the same that Jesus called us to do, and the baton's being passed on from generation to generation. I think the problem is when we adopt a leadership paradigm, and I think that's why it is important just putting our, the flag into ground and say, hey, at least, we're talking about, we want to raise up disciple-making leaders that are going to make disciples.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's good. Yeah, I think that for the shift from, I think I used to believe that if we just discipled people, you would get leaders. And even if you define leadership, purely biblically and theologically, like people who can shepherd and steward a group of people towards health. And you could sort of model, many shepherds that follow Jesus as a shepherd, leading people to green pastures, living water, fruitful lives, that sort of thing. If you just discipled people, you would get that kind of leader. But I do think that there does require a development of people, and I used to believe that every disciple was, that kind of a biblical leader. And I now, living it, and then also even looking in the course of church history, that's not necessarily true, that every disciple becomes that kind of shepherding, biblical framework for a leader. And so I do think that some of the questions for us moving into the future is how do we develop that kind of person, particularly, as you were saying, Winfield, that our culture portrays different norms for CEO. I think we even see that, today on this election. Even trying to explain to my children that, whoever wins actually doesn't have that dramatic of an impact on our daily life, and not because we're super rich or privileged or outside of America, but because most impact happens locally on the ground and all of those sorts of things. So I think we kind of envision needing to get these kinds of leaders who then in the end don't have a big impact locally. All that to say, I think that we do have to intentionally focus on how do we disciple people who are leaders, who have that ability to move a movement forward. And I think that requires a lot of intentional focus and isn't the same thing. Yeah.
Winfield, I'm curious, as you talk about kind of some of the professionalization of what a leader looks like, if I can kind of summarize what you said, is that there's also some who would say kind of, hey, the way we develop leaders has changed and kind of followed a more Western mindset, even in the seminary, kind of, training up professionalized pastors. And I want to caveat this by saying we've all been to seminary, we've all gleaned from it, we all see a place and value of it. But for you as a church planter, a pastor, and one who works closely with and for a seminary, I'm curious to know your take on kind of that professionalization, even of the institutions that are most looked to, I think I can say, to train leaders for the church right now.
Yeah.
What's your take on the professionalization there? And then kind of the balance of church and parachurch, or church and institution?
No, that's a great question, because again, the seminary education, just like everything in the moment, is just really in flux. One of the things like I have a Master of Divinity, which is, depending on what institution, maybe a 90-hour degree. You've got Greek, Hebrew, you got theology, you got biblical studies, you got whatever your specialization is. It's a great degree, you can teach multiple disciplines at an undergrad. Very thankful for that. That is, many seminaries are moving away from that, as pastors and leaders will be increasingly bivocational, co-vocational, will not do traditional seminary. You're seeing seminaries engaging in hybrid forms of education. One of the key degrees that I'm involved in, which has been one of the most successful kind of MA programs, is our MA Intercultural Studies church planning degree. And it's a hybrid where students are a part of a cohort. So they're a part of a learning community for 3 years with the same people, and they come to campus for 1 week a year, which allows them to stay in context. But it's not all online. So there's a pedagogy here. Like a lot of seminaries have just gone all online. You can just do online courses and you have never interface with anyone else. Well, what we've seen is the power of learning in community, learning in context. So they're applying what they're learning in their particular context. And I think that's an example of many of these leaders are church planners, or they're on a church planning team. I have a good portion of the current cohort. The other unique thing about this allows us to have global learners. So we have students from around the world. We've got students in this cohort I'm working with right now in Brazil, Europe. There's a whole handful. There's a movement of first, second generation Bhutanese, Nepalese speaking pastors that they're all church planners, because it's a new movement. And within the last 10 years, they've grown from 0 to over 500,000 people in 10 years. And so we've got them a part of it. And so the hybrid approach allows people like that to access seminary education, but not to be bound by it, if that makes sense. So I think the traditional, probably in the next 5-10 years, again, Asbury has several campuses. Our main campus where I'm at is kind of the brick and mortar. You come to Asbury, we've got a great residential program. I'm not preaching against that, so hear me there. I want to have a job at the end of the day. But I think the future of seminary education is going to be hybrid. I think it's going to be much more allowing people to stay in context. But I like the hybrid approach because it allows you to stay in context, but be a part of a cohort with other people. It allows you to actually come to campus once a year and see a professor, smell books, go in the library and get some of that kind of immersive learning. So I think that's kind of the hybrid thing that we're doing right now that has been really successful, in my opinion, and is fueling some of the growth that we're seeing.
That's great. And Brad, I want to come to you in a second to hear about even kind of some of the stuff you're doing in-house. But one question that was already posted in the Q&A relates right to what Winfield was talking about. Shouldn't we just post all the best classes and lectures from seminary online for free or cheap so that folks could learn semi-easily? Well, yeah, respond to that.
Yeah. So keep in mind, I'm a church planner. I are one. I came out of, planted multiple churches. I've worked with multiple networks. I got, friends, across the U.S. and around the world. So when I came to Asbury about 6 years ago, we had I forget how many $1 million given for this initiative. Timothy Tennant's our president. He had been in a Gordon Conwell for a number of years, had a vision for the seminary being a global and church planning seminary. And we have really done that. We have transitioned the seminary to be a major church planning training center for the global Christianity. And when I came here as a practitioner, putting on those lenses, I see Brad's cool glasses. My glasses are not as cool as yours, but if I put on my church planter glasses, I said, hey, there's no way we're going to train thousands of leaders around the world through Master of Divinity programs. It's just not going to. So it took a while, took me 2 years to get this approved, but we created a church planning institute model. It's a non-academic certificate, but it's actually robust. It's taught by professors and practitioners. We contextualize it with the leaders that we're working with, and it allows us to go in global major city centers around the world and partner with partners. So the first one we did was in Nakuru, Kenya, Hyderabad, India, Sao Paulo, Brazil. And it's been amazing. In 4 years, we've trained 1,000 leaders in 20 different nations. And it's not just video based. I think to answer the question, not to critique the question, but I don't want to watch a talking head for 10 hours. I would much rather have someone in front of me. And so this is, again, it's a hybrid where we're partnering with partners in regional city center locations. And a lot of this came out of my own experience working with multiple networks, 15 years ago, Acts 29, Christ Together in the Southeast, helping different denominations establish structures in city centers. And I think regional hubs, back to the leadership development point, I think regional hubs are really key to this. And so I do agree with that. I think here's where I'm going to land. I think one of the most dynamic degrees that I know of is the Doctor of Ministry, because you can learn, like one of the things I do is I recruit global and national level leaders to the programs that I work with at the doctoral level. So these guys are thinking about how we're going to reach a nation for Jesus. They're not just saying, how am I going to reach my neighborhood? They're thinking on a national scale. That's really cool. And the impact of that's amazing. 3 years, you get those type people working together. They're changing the nations. The Master of Divinity, or this hybrid program, for instance, each of us are on the call. You would probably agree, you don't have to have a master's to plant a church. However, seminary education does help you think at a deeper critical level. That would be kind of my argument. Why? If someone said, why seminary education? Does it even matter? I would say it helps you think at a deeper, more high critical level as a thought leader. Right. The average planter, I don't believe needs to. However, this idea of a hybrid institute certificate allows them to think deeper than they would by just attending a boot camp or watching a video. It's learning in community. They're wrestling with things at a deep level. They're getting access to some of the stuff they would get at seminary, but they don't have to go to seminary. So those are different levels of theological education.
Yeah, kind of going back to you don't just need the campfire is kind of what you're saying. We're kind of going back to that. There's the Sherpa, there's the community,
Correct.
There's that kind of stuff.
It kind of integrates those different pieces.
Mm-hmm.
And the other thing about those is, I think you were thinking in terms of different levels of education for different types of people. How do we develop leaders at different levels? I think those are other ways. How do we contextualize it in essence?
That's good. Going to Brad, some of what you guys have done in Culver City is trying to reclaim some of the church's place in that. So you want to share a little bit of that? In fact, it even echoes a question that was asked. We need to, you mentioned earlier, not just wishing you had more leaders, we need to develop more. And so someone asked, what does that process look like for you? So kind of an easy setup for you to describe some of what you guys are doing on the local church level.
Yeah, that's a great point. Great question. I think, we've tried to, basically answer that question of realizing a couple of things. Like, to reach our city, Los Angeles, it's a very barrier. There's a lot of barriers to entry. So like the parachute church plant person who's just like, I'm going to move there and plant a church. There's a lot of barriers to that. Like, there's cultural barriers, there's economic barriers. It's also very hard to do that anywhere. And so I think when we realize, like, for us to see a movement of the gospel happen in our city, we're actually going to have to train up people who live here already, who have the economic means already to live in the city and the relational networks already in the city. Like, that should be our priority, not recruiting, church planters into the city. And so we created a program that we try to walk through those 5 things, those 5 metaphors for learning, where we're training up what I think in the past we would just consider lay leaders, people that have, or now co-vocational leaders who are leading a missional community or a DNA group, which is like a band of brothers and sisters, or like a class, the missional community. So they're living it out and seeing how you make disciples. But then also we get together and we do a whole year on biblical theology and thinking through even practical theology, where we read a lot of different people and get together, and then we draw a name out of the hat, and people, whoever's name comes out, that person leads the discussion. And so it's a 2-hour discussion. And it's all happens in my living room or backyard. And we just, talk through it, as well as me kind of guiding people through that whole process. And then a second year that gets into more of what we might consider theological leadership of how do you, pursue your own formation, how do you do evangelism, justice, all of those sorts of things. And we kind of took the learnings from all of these different people who have tried to put together church planting residencies, and we just try to apply those to say, couldn't we do that for a scale like this, and sort of pulling it out, dragging it out. And so, that's what we've been doing. That's what we've been experimenting with. I would honestly say COVID's put a big wrench in that, just as people in the city are and myself included, more stressed, more tired, more fatigued. Though our course on spiritual formation was really impactful and really wonderful. And our hope through that is that as we add more churches into participating in this, and we get a greater diversity of people, we'd actually see second and third generation of people leading within this city, planting more churches of a variety of sizes and even methodologies, but having come from that kind of learning. And it does, and the stuff that we read is textbooks that I read in seminary. So we're trying not to boil it down to some of that point that you were making, Winfield, of seminary as a context of thinking really deeply about things. And I think that particularly and I think a disciple movement or decentralized kind of vibe, we can really go into, well, the classroom doesn't matter at all. The classroom's silly, classroom's stupid. Like, what really matters is one-on-one. And it's like, no, it really makes a difference. And globally, we have all of these sources of wisdom. And so it's really foolishness to be like, no, I don't want to learn anything. I just want to learn from Brad. I don't want to learn from, this huge host of saints, this incredible cloud of witnesses that could tell us something about what it means to be a person of faith, a woman of faith, a leader. So. That's what we're doing locally.
I think that's to that point again. The stuff we're going through now, yes, it's a unique cultural contextual moment. However, the church has lived through pandemics before. The church has lived through civil unrest. The church has lived through persecutions and has thrived.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's where, if I would say one of the biggest critiques I have of Western Christianity and the missional church movement, of which I am a part of, so is the ahistoric, the lack of even understanding our own history. And it all belongs to us. There's this idea that, well, if it happened before the Reformation, it was worthless. Listen, some of the greatest missionary movements the world has ever known happened before the Reformation. And there's wisdom.
Mm-hmm.
I call it the treasure box of church history. And it's there for the taking, folks. It doesn't matter whether you're Baptist, Baptist-costal, Pentecostal, whatever, we can draw from it all. And so again, my interactions are my own personal study. I've always looked back to history, but I always test it with what is God doing globally. And so what's happening in culture, but also what are some key lessons that we can kind of learn from the global church. And what you see is a lot of these patterns that have fueled movement historically are also repeated over and over throughout different movements, but also are fueling and stoking the growth of global movements today throughout Christianity.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah, that's good.
There's a question, Winfield, you might have answered it, about the Marxist movement. What does discipleship look like to you? Do you want to mention that?
Yeah.
For folks, real quick, for folks who have other questions, we have a few minutes. We've answered several, but if you have another couple last questions, we want to get to those before we have to wrap up in a bit. So, Winfield.
Yeah, no, that's great. I'm actually in a band meeting. I meet with 3 other guys each week. COVID hit. Guess what? We just went to Zoom. We haven't even missed a single week. And there are weeks that, it doesn't feel super spiritual. What it did for me I've been in a band for 3 or 4 years now, same group, same guys. I was all over the place, literally on a plane 2-3 times a month and doing international travel several times a year, and what I found was I was kind of becoming disembodied. I was training all these other people on how to do this stuff, and I wasn't even doing that myself. And this, being a part of a discipleship band, has anchored me in the moment, in the daily. It's given me accountability. It's really been amazing. And it's what I love about it is it's not this emotional roller coaster. It's not this hyper charismatic experience. It roots you. And I think that's what we need. We need to be rooted in a rhythm and a practice. And again, back to the early Methodists, they were called Methodists because people were making fun of them because they had a method. They discipled. They were like, oh, they're Methodists, or they met together each week. They prayed for each other. They kept each other accountable. And there have been weeks that I've just needed someone to look me in the face and say, how's it with your soul? I knew I was going to answer the question, is there any sin in your life? What are you struggling with? And then, what is the Spirit doing in your life? There's some powerful questions. And what I love about it is you can kind of contextualize that. And so I look at Wesley's discipleship structures in the book, and what I try to do in each of the chapters, also highlight other movements. So it's not just about the Wesley. I look at global Christianity. I look at the Moravian revival. I look at Celtic Christianity. And then I also look at contemporary examples, like one of my close friends, Robbie Gallaty, who's a Reformed Southern Baptist, pastors a megachurch, has developed the whole, he's funny, he did his PhD, but did his PhD on Wesley. He's like, I don't tell the Baptists, but I did my discipleship framework stuff because it was so rich and robust. And then we've applied this. I say that jokingly. He's written several books. He just came out with the book I endorsed called Replicate. He's a great thinker in how to take that system and apply it to a contemporary context. And I think that's the beauty of this, is contextualizing some of these historic examples for your particular culture and context. And I've seen how this stuff's replicable in a variety of ways. So I think really we're talking about is there's different types of learning in different spaces. Back to Brad's original opening comment. So the band meeting is this 3 to 5 member space that the average person who's in a quote small group will not feel free to talk about their sin openly. If they get a pornography issue and they're in a group of 20 people and there's people from, the other sex in the group, they're just not going to do it. Yeah. So the band meeting is one discipleship space. The small group is more of kind of maybe a cognitive learning space where people are learning in small group studies. It's kind of a smaller classroom. The third space was the society, which is essentially like a worship gathering. This is kind of a group of, say, 70 to 150, where there's a dynamic that happens when we gather together in a more corporate setting. And I think in the midst of this but in this COVID world, the church in the West is going to have to rediscover the domestic, intimate spaces. And I'll just land on this plane. If you can mute me after this. But if I was pastoring a church right now, I would focus on rediscovering the domestic church, coming alongside and equipping families. Don't think your public large worship gatherings are going to do it. I think we've got to go with deep discipleship. We got to have a long view. I think the other thing we can learn from historic Christianity is the rediscovery of catechesis. We don't know how to pass on our faith. It's like the book of Judges. There arose a generation that knew not the Lord. Well, how did America shift from kind of these early kind of historic, say, more Judeo-Christian understandings to where we find ourselves today? Is the church has not catechized from generation to generation. So Keller's New City Catechism, I've written a number of catechisms. I think the cool thing is local churches can kind of, these are historic frameworks that you can kind of create and contextualize for yourself. I'll pause there, Ben.
No, it's good. There's a couple questions that came in, so kind of maybe potentially rapid fire for you guys. One, do you have suggestions of ways for potential church planners or leaders within church planning teams to become best equipped for the task? So this gets into APEST, I think, apostolic, evangelistic.
Yep.
Are there different roles that kind of APEST can play, both on the delivery and the receiving end, if I may be kind of overly bifurcating there?
Brad,
how do you equip people on a team?
Essentially, yeah. How can both, apostles, or let's just take in 2 minutes, do all 5 APEST on both the giving and receiving side. How can apostles equip apostles? How can shepherds be equipped by shepherds, etc.?
I think, and this could be me just like getting too dogmatic on the historical sociology study that I referenced in the beginning, but I do think that so whenever I'm developing a learning environment, I put it through those 5 metaphors, and I think that's the way that someone's going to grow in whatever it is. And so I think if you're talking about
the 5 metaphors, you're not talking about APEST, that 5.
No, I'm talking about like the cave and
just
so
to make, yeah.
Too many 5s now. But I would say like, I think to equip, apostolic leaders, you want to have them kind of sit and listen to some of the stories of apostolic leaders around the world through church history, that sort of thing. Then you'd want them to be around other apostolic leaders, just kind of learning and gleaning. You'd want them to have some personal reflection about like, how is God sending them to pioneer and doing all that. You'd want them to try it and have a Sherpa who's there to guide them and walk them through. And so I think that's how it would be. That's how I would try to equip around all of those things. And even to what we're doing locally, the 3rd year of what we'll do is kind of evaluate and do an assessment on how each individual kind of fits into a team that would plant and lead a church, and how they're particularly gifted and perspective, and then kind of map out a unique learning experience for them, so that we could have teams that are all of that. So that's my quick answer.
Yeah, that's good. I'm going to move on to one more. There's a question that arises often of, should leadership development within the church just be producing leaders for the church, or should we be producing leaders for, if I can kind of overgeneralize a phrase that's kind of common for many participants, kind of to be the church in society. Back to Winfield talked about like the hierarchy or the pyramid scheme, you even called it, of within the church. Sometimes there's like, oh, you can be a small group leader and then a deacon and then an elder. And that feels, again, a little bit westernized, professionalized. Should our leadership development be just to raise up leaders for kind of the church organization, or to be the church wherever we go?
Well, that's why I was really trying to say with discipleship, as creating a discipleship structure, we should be discipling people to be leaders in every sector of society. So Mark Knoll's Scandal of the Evangelical Mind, if you've never read it, go out and get it. It's a heavy book, but he says, what is the scandal of the evangelical mind is? There isn't one. And his argument is, the late 1800s, revivalism, from Edwards forward, the emphasis came to reducing Christianity to come accept Jesus in an altar. And with the creation of seminaries, and again, the emphasis of the church, if there was a bright leader, we would send them to seminary. Who cares if they're a doctor or a lawyer or a politician? And so what has happened is Christians have removed themselves from every, if you look historically, what has happened? Why have we gotten in such a mess in the U.S. in the last 50 to 100 years? Christianity has removed itself from the public spaces and the public spheres of the culture. We no longer engage culture in context. And so kind of back to that question is, we need to be raising up leaders who are going to be, politicians, civil engineers, lawyers, doctors, educators. We need to be sending Christians, disciples into every corner of our society, our community. And that's the work of the local church. That's where you can't teach that stuff in seminary. And that's where, back to that discipleship stuff, is we've got to be equipping people to follow Jesus and to make disciples in the marketplace. So absolutely, I would say we've got to recover the marketplace, and we've got to bring the gospel. Great Leslie Newbegin, dig out some Leslie Newbegin Trinitarian theology, gospel church world. We got to bring those things back together. And that's where, to be honest with you, the church has failed. If there are so many Christians right now that are scratching their heads and they're saying, how did it come to this? That's what we're saying today on election day. If we're really honest, we're saying, how did it come to this? And it's because the church has removed itself from the culture and context. And we've got to make disciples that are going to go out into the real world and interact with unchurched people. We got to do the long, hard work of rebuilding the credibility for the gospel and for Jesus. And it's going to take making disciples, building relationships, engaging culture, community, getting out there, building bridges. It's going to be a long, hard work. We got a long road ahead of us. But I believe with every fiber of my being, discipleship is at the very heart of what God has called us to do in terms of developing leaders.
That's great. So if I can summarize some themes that I've heard and then give you a chance to any final quick moment, what does leadership development of the future look like? Some things that we've talked about is it seems like it's going to be more relational, which means it's not going to be necessarily efficient per se. It's going to be a little more holistic, so spiritual as well as kind of experiential, hands-on, in addition to continuing the obvious need for head knowledge, but not exclusively head knowledge content. Feels like it's going to be more deprofessionalized, as some of what you guys have referred to. And then maybe even redefining leadership. Winfield mentioned kind of our view of what a leader is has been shaped by something outside of Bible moral culture, which means also then leadership development is probably a little bit more kingdom oriented than organizational oriented. That's a little bit of what I've heard. I'd be happy to for one of you to nuance that, or to say yes or nope, that's not it at all. And we can start over.
Back to the Sherpa thing. I do love those spaces, Brad. I'm gonna rip that off for you. Email those to me. I'd love to see it if you've got a little piece you've written on it. But honestly, I want to emphasize the Sherpa, because we don't do that well in the West. We don't know how to disciple people. We don't know how to be like Jesus. and discipling again, someone who's getting ready to go to medical school, they can be a follower of Christ. I remember in Outer Banks, one of the guys who came to faith had he was a Green Beret. He had just come back from Afghanistan. He was one of these mercenaries for hire, and the guy came to faith and was one of the most raw, disciple making experience I've ever worked with. And this guy could go back to Afghanistan, and he was leading people to Christ. I couldn't go there and do that, but because of the long, dirty, hard work and the messy disciple making that I did with him in our church community, it equipped him to work with military guys with PTSD and they've killed people, they've seen people die. Does that make sense? Like, the discipleship equipped him to be able to then disciple people in his, quote, world and sphere of influence. So I think that's where we gotta get back to those intimate, those different discipleship spaces. That there's something that each of those spaces do. But here's my point. I'll end with this. What we all can do is disciple someone else. You might not be a great Bible teacher. You might not be able to preach in front of 50 to 100 people, but every Christian is called to one-on-one discipleship. Every Christian is called to make disciples in their home. And that's where it begins. If we don't do it there, the other spaces don't really matter. And so we got to reclaim each of those spheres and spaces, I think, for making disciples for the 21st century.
That's good. Brad, final word?
That's really good. I think that, that's a really good final word, Winfield. The only thing I would, kind of add just on a day like today, is from Henry Nouwen, which is so good. I read this book every year. I think everybody who's given that task.
Is it In the Name of Jesus?
In the Name of Jesus.
Oh, I was going to quote.
So I've got several lines here to read. But he talks through these different temptations that we have as leaders. It's a really good book. But one of the things I wanted to say because he talks about the task of the future leader. He says this in one point. He says, when we are securely rooted in personal intimacy with the source of life, it will be possible to remain flexible without being relativistic, convinced without being rigid, willing to confront without being offensive, gentle and forgiving without being soft, and true witnesses without being manipulative. For Christian leadership to be truly fruitful in the future, a movement from the moral to the mystic is required. And I just think that's a good trajectory goal for us to keep in mind. And I do think if you're wanting to think about a theological reflection on leadership, this is perhaps the best. There it is.
I love that. And if I could just 1 second piggyback on that, Brad, I'm so thankful you brought that up. One of the points that I had wanted to mention, if I could reference kind of what I've been working on for the last couple of years, the dear friend of mine who's in Ireland, we've developed a missional formation coaching framework that is, it's designed to help leaders thrive by promoting healthy rhythms that connect the spiritual and missional practices together. Mm-hmm. What's often missing in the missional conversation is nobody's talking about the spiritual stuff that Brad just mentioned. And Henry Nouwen's book, In the Name of Jesus, is the book that I put in the hands of leaders. It's such a profound yet very simple reflection on Christian leadership for the future. And so what I would love for us to do another session just on that, because it really is so important, is getting the spiritual formation that goes behind being a missional leader in today's world. And so I think that's a good way to note that, hey, we could do all this stuff, but if we aren't centered and rooted in a deep, intimate, profound, rooted relationship with Christ and the triune God, it's all for naught, and we'll burn out and we'll rust out. And we've got to minister out of a deep contemplative center. So good.
It is good. And that takes us to the end of our time. Thanks for sticking around a little longer than normal. And I will say, Saturate has a desire to come alongside churches, and our membership has loads of free audio, video, written resources, courses even, to help develop leaders. And yet, I think I'd be remiss of where we've landed this, which kind of is back to where we started as well, of going, none of it matters if we don't find ourselves in the cave and just dwelling with Jesus. And maybe today especially is a good day to go find ourselves in a cave and just remember our source in our life. And that all of this is, to summarize what both of you have said for the last hour, all of this is for naught if the Spirit is not in it, and if we are trying to take on too much of a mantle that is not ours to bear. So 2 weeks, we'll do our last Church of the Future webinar with SOMA leaders from across the country, saying, here's what we're seeing in our missional communities, both during COVID and things we hope will last post-COVID, again, whenever and whatever post-COVID means. But for today, Brad, Winfield, thank you both so much, and thank you all who've tuned in for spending part of your Tuesday with us. Have a good day.
Awesome.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks for having us.